Brian, can you see the PowerPoint?
I can see the PowerPoint.
All right, do you want us to head to the agenda? Welcome,
Let's
everybody.
go for it.
All right.
Hey, welcome. On behalf of the Board of Directors and our Chair, our General Manager, Deborah Johnson, and our Senior Leadership Team, thank you for your continued engagement in Reimagine RTD. We've got a ton of stuff to cover today, and we're all excited to share it with you and get the engagement going. So let me give you a quick safety moment. As you know, the heat isn't the only issue we deal with here in the Front Range. We also deal with air quality. So pay attention when you're planning your activities around not just the heat, but as well as the air quality to make sure that you take the best care of yourself and others as well. With that, I'm gonna move really quickly. I told you I was. Because now I've only got 1 minute left for my 5 minutes. I'm gonna do a really fast recap of the Reimagine RTD Rebuilding Service Work Group. Some of you even were part of that, but it was a great meeting we had initially with the group. We talked about why we're getting together. We covered fiscal with Doug McLeod, and he's actually going to talk about some of that today. We had Jesse Carter describe some of the ridership trends, and then we spent the bulk of the meeting talking to the group about their ideas on what are some of the things that RTDs should be paying attention to and watching as we begin the process of rebuilding our service, the metrics, the milestones, the indicators that are going to be helpful for us as we move forward. It was a very successful meeting. We got a good group, and we're looking forward to continued subgroup meetings. Bill Soroy will be giving you updates on that, and we hope to have you all back together with that group soon. Thank you so much for your participation with that. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Holly.
Fantastic, thanks. So other items from the that are on the agenda today, we're going to really focus in on the mobility plan for the future. There have been questions that have come up specific to, and I think this is sort of out there in our world, RTD's financial picture. So we're going to try and dig into that a little bit today and talk about where we're headed with that. We don't have all the answers for you, but we have a good start to that, and we'll talk about the next steps for that as well. Future mobility, we want to talk about, we're going to move another step into the scenario planning. Thank you to all of you who did the driver's exercise. We have some results for you today, so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we have a really terrific tool, travel demand modeling tool, that we're going to talk about today as well. And I'm hoping that Cambridge Systematics is out on the line because they're going to step us through that. Following up on some conversations that we had at the last meeting about whether RTD was a mobility integrator or a mobility operator. We all landed, your group, the technical working group, the advisory committee, and the citizens advisory committee all landed towards the side of being an integrator. So we're going to take the next step today to talk just briefly about what this project will do to start to better define what does it actually mean for RTD to be an integrator, and how does that weave into the mobility plan for the future. Then next steps and updates, we're going to have an update for you on the zero emission vehicle work that we're doing as part of this project, the facilities analysis, and how part of that is how we can electrify the current facilities that are not, and what that might look like. And then of course, a lot of public and stakeholder engagement as well. So we'll touch on that. So we've got a packed meeting. So let's go ahead and just dive right in. If we want to go to slide 6, I think it is. It is the one that is, yes, right there. So I thought it might be useful for us to talk just about the steps that are within the mobility plan for the future. And we've had this organized a couple of different ways, but I thought a higher level might be useful to guide our conversations. So as we're moving through the mobility plan for the future, our current effort and what we've actually been working on, even during the SOP process, the system optimization process, is to really understand the current state of RTD. How is RTD operating? What are their services? What is their workforce and their current workforce issues? We're looking at district boundaries. We're looking at the current fleet and, to get to the fleet electrification and that sort of thing. Then we want to look at the future state of RTD. And this is where we start to talk about scenario planning. So we're going to dig into that a little bit more today. we need to look at that so that we can start to define how RTD responds to the future. What is it that we do in response to, say, changing travel patterns, or maybe it is disruptive technologies. How does RTD respond to those things? So we'll talk about strategies, which could be policies. It could be the type of services that RTD operates, capital investments, partnerships, all the ways that RTD can respond. And of course, we started to brainstorm about those 2 meetings ago as well. So we'll bring back that list to the group, and we can start to sort of sort those out and see if those continue to make sense as we look at what that future state and what those scenarios might look like. How do we best respond to those scenarios? And then we get into our vision, which is really talking about implementation. This is where we start to understand our fiscal constraint. Obviously, we don't have all the money in the world to do anything we want, and start to set priorities in that implementation piece. And of course, all of this, we are always evaluating all of these against our guiding principles, which we've talked about before, but of course, being financially responsible, providing mobility, equity, partnerships, and thinking about the environment. One of the comments that we got, if we want to move into the next slide, and I want to just tell you right now that I very much appreciate feedback that we get between meetings, and we do try to always reflect on what we're talking about and making sure that we're having meaningful meetings where we can get meaningful dialogue with this group. And we think it's really important to hear from you and try to enlist this group the best we can to help guide RTD and guide being critical of the recommendations that will be made out of this process. So one of the comments that came into us was, when are we going to dig into the hard stuff? We want to have some hard conversations. And so I thought it might be helpful for us to just talk about when through the process, so the process that we just outlined above in that graphic, when in the process do we start to have these conversations? So July and August at this meeting and over this month and next, we're going to start that dialogue. Well, we've started it, but we're going to continue the dialogue about RTD's current and future financial state. So you're going to see a little bit of that today, but you'll see more of that in the September and October timeframe. And then certainly when we get into that needs-based and fiscally constrained plan in November and December, that's where it really comes home, and you start to see, how much money do we really have to work with, or lack of money do we have to work with? So setting the stage for that. The next one is, how do we best plan for mobility needs and trends? There's been some people that have expressed a concern about, well, we don't know where this is going to land. We have COVID and people are coming back to work. And what I want to express to you is that this is what scenario planning is and what planning is. We never know the future. We don't ever know what the future holds for us. I think we have a better handle on that more than ever because we just went through a pandemic and we realized that we did not know that. And so when we're planning, we're always looking to a future that we don't have an exact crystal ball for, but what we want to do is plan for the agency to be responsive and resilient, regardless of what the future holds. So we look at different futures and we make plans to respond that are responsive to those in a broad sense. So we'll dig into that a little more today too. And then continuing that conversation that we've started and we've been having about RTD's role as that mobility integrator. When we move into September and October, we have a travel demand modeling tool that we're going to talk about in more detail today. In September and October, we're hoping to have some really, I think what's going to be some really interesting results about how different driving forces and variables could influence our mobility needs and demands in our region. So Cambridge is going to help us talk through a little bit about how that works today. When we come back in that September, October timeframe, we're going to have some results. We're going to be able to say, under this scenario, we expect a lot more people to be on transit or fewer people to be on transit. We expect rider, trip length to be longer or shorter. We're gonna have a whole bunch of outputs that we can look at, and we can try to respond then. How is RTD going to respond to that? And that is the real key and the important thing that we will deliver out of this project is how does RTD respond? So this next box down, the one in the very middle of the table there, is also an evaluation of us having a hard conversation. When we look at those results, Do RTD's current commitments, how they operate service currently, their current policies, are they the right course of action for RTD to respond to those different futures? And those are going to be some hard conversations, because in some cases, the answer may be no. Maybe we're on a path that is not right. So let's course correct the path there. So please be sure to be with us and present and ready to have some good and productive dialogue in that September, October timeframe. November and December, we already talked about that. Prioritization. There is not an infinite amount of money, unfortunately. So we will have to do some prioritization, which is always a challenging conversation, but important for the success of the agency. If we want the agency to actually be able to deliver anything for our region, we are going to have to be able to come to some consensus on some prioritization and at least help guide what might be reasonable. And then we can send that to the board of directors and they can say, that's a great idea or it's not a great idea, and give us some new direction. So hopefully that helps answer some of the questions about where we will have dialogue along the way. And certainly if you have questions about that or other things that you think we should be answering, I would like to hear that. Certainly, please feel free to raise your hand or type in the chat as well. If we don't have any, I don't think I see any hands raised or anything in the chat. So I think we can go into the next slide, which is part of the questions that were raised, is talking about RTD's current financial picture. So Doug McLeod with RTD is going to join us and help us step through where RTD sits today with their finances.
Thank you, Holly. And please go ahead and go to the next slide. And thank you, Holly, for setting up the setting the stage for this. So basically, this is going to sound like a lot of doom and gloom, but I think the good news is that we have a better picture. And as time goes by, we get a better picture emerging of what our ongoing revenue sources are going to be and what our service levels will be. So as Holly mentioned, as we get later in the year, towards the late fall timeframe is when we'll be developing the 2022 budget. We'll have a better idea of how things look going forward and some of the obligations that we need to meet in future years. So just to back up and discuss what's happened with RTD's finances, here's just some key items that impacted RTD's finances. So during the COVID pandemic, we reached a low in ridership of a 70% reduction. That's overall. There are pockets of good news. So the A line maintained about 50% of its pre-COVID ridership. And then we had pockets within some of our bus routes that almost stayed flat in its ridership. Saw big reductions over on the light rail side and some other lines, which necessitated some reductions in our service levels. So what that meant to RTD in terms of fare revenue, which was the biggest contributor to our revenue losses, was about $150 million loss in revenues in 2020 versus 2019. We expect to have about a $150 million less revenue threshold in 2021 as well. Most of that coming from lower fare revenues. We've seen a small increase in our ridership. We're about back to the 60% reduced level with slight increases. So we see some return to work and some more use of our services, which will contribute to fare revenue going forward, but we're still approaching that cautiously because we don't know what the future will hold. In addition, those $150 million annual revenue losses that we've experienced in 2020 and 2021 projected, our plan back in 2019, prior to going into COVID, actually projected revenue growth in each of those successive years. So in addition to the $150 million loss, we've also seen in our new forecast, a loss in those growth projections as well, including sales and use taxes. So that's had an impact as well. We will be developing our 6-year midterm financial plan in September-October timeframe, which will help guide up the budget process for 2022, but it'll give us a little bit better picture of how things are looking at that point in time. Some of the things we had done is we had initiated several layoffs. We laid off about 89 salaried employees, in addition to almost 400 represented or frontline employees. which were subsequently brought back almost immediately in January. In 2020, we did furloughs. We had significant reductions and delays in other expenditures, particularly state of good repair type maintenance of the assets that we do have. And I'll talk about that here in a minute. And then, of course, as Holly mentioned, there's a lot of uncertainty about the future state of transit. I mentioned the different ridership patterns that we're seeing now. I think there's going to be a shift probably in those that actually use our services. And that will help guide the service that we put out on the streets. Thank you, Holly. Meeting RTD fiscal policy. So RTD has a fiscal policy, and I think the two key points that come out of there, it's about a 10-page document, but two particular items that I think are important to RTD are the policy to have a target of 3 months of operating expenses in reserves or in our fund balances. So it's kind of like a savings account, a rainy day account. That was established back in 2011. The reason being is RTD has 2/3 of its revenues coming from sales and use taxes, which tend to fluctuate. And occasionally we'll have a recession, which really affects sales and use taxes. So we want to be able to have about 3 months of operating expenses kind of tucked away to smooth out those bumps. 3 months is a best practice. That's how we arrived at that amount. And a monthly expenditure operating expenses is about $51 million, excluding depreciation for RTD. We operate on a balanced budget, so there's trade-offs. So prior to the COVID crisis, our budget was about $1 billion in revenue and $1 billion in expenses. So we balanced that budget. The expectation for RTD is to provide efficient services, not overspend, but not underspend, but also use taxpayer dollars wisely. So we basically had a balanced budget. What comes in goes out with an allowance for our fund balances. There's trade-offs, obviously. So if we choose to spend money on one thing, that means we still have the same slice, we still have the same pie. So if we take that slice and use it for something else, that means that pie doesn't change sizes. It just means we have to take something else off of our expenditure list. One of the challenges I think we've had, and particularly in my area, and I need to do a better job of this, is communicating the difference between our one-time revenue sources and recurring revenue. So I think everybody is aware that we've received some COVID relief funding grants from the federal government. Those are one-time funding allocations that come to RTD. Difference between that and recurring revenues is we have recurring revenues through sales and use taxes and fare revenues, which can fluctuate, but we would expect those to be ongoing. So when we compare the two, one time we want to try to apply those to one-time expenditures, because once that money runs out, we don't have another revenue stream to replace it. So we have to be very cautious in how we apply the funding that we do receive. Future level revenue expenditures, just touched on this a little while ago, that that's very uncertain at this point in time. There are some expenditures we know we have obligations for that I'll talk about. That will affect some of our decisions going forward. Borrowing restrictions. So TABOR, Taxpayer Bill of Rights in Colorado, requires that any government agency receive voter approval to borrow funds. So in the case of bonds, we really have used all of our TABOR authority at this point. I don't have a lot of capacity to borrow more money currently. And then, of course, the most recent strategic plan is emerging and being communicated publicly. We need to align our budget with those strategic outcomes that we're trying to achieve. There's 4 key strategic outcomes. And those outcomes, we want to align our budget to drive those strategic outcomes. Other things that don't really contribute to those core strategic outcomes or success outcomes, probably, if we don't have enough funding for it, probably won't get funded. Okay, so just some specific challenges to get down into the weeds just a little bit here. Some of the items that we have that are definitely going to require some financial support. We have a $205 million backlog of state of good repair items. And so when I talk about state of good repair, that's maintaining the assets that we currently have. So it consists mainly of replacing rolling stock. So like our buses, we have a lot of old buses that we were in the process of replacing. COVID hit and we put that on hold. So A good chunk of that $205 million is replacing buses. We have a lot of infrastructure that's getting older. Our first rail service opened, I believe, is 1994. There's infrastructure items on there, such as overhead catenary wire that needs regular replacement. Some of these have to do with safety and compliance, so it's not a nice to have thing. It's really maintaining what we have. And then there's some other outstanding items. So litigation settlement costs. There's currently litigation with a judge. We're awaiting a decision. Denver Transit Partners has filed a claim to recover some costs for the delay in opening the A line and the B line. So there's issues like that that could be fairly sizable and have a fairly large financial impact to RTD that we need to plan for and be ready for it if there is a settlement that comes out of that. Then on a recurring basis, the things that we have to be very careful of and judicious in the way that we approach spending is our service levels, obviously. Adding back service is a recurring cost. We could get ourselves in the position if we add too much service back, revenues don't recover. We run out of the COVID relief funding, and then we have to go back to where we were in January of 2021, do layoffs, reduce expenses, et cetera. So we would like to avoid that, obviously. Contractual and inflationary increases. So every year we have inflationary increases built into many of our contracts. We contract out about 58% of our fixed route services, as well as our ADA and FlexRide services. So there's inflationary increases built into those contracts, as well as we also have a collective bargaining agreement that we're going to be going into negotiations, and soon that expires in February of 2022. So that may have some financial impacts as well. Fair study and equity analysis, another thing that we're not certain about. There's been a lot of commentary from the public about the complicated fare structure and the perceived expensiveness of our fare structure. So we're looking at, what can we do to fix that? That's about an 18-month process because it has to go through an equity analysis. But it's possible that that could result in even lower fares in addition to the impact that's been created through lower ridership. Debt service and tabor restrictions, we have to pay our debt. We're trying to fund most everything we can now that we've gotten done with the majority of our infrastructure building. We're trying to fund things with cash instead of debt to keep our expenditures lower. And then we also have outstanding liabilities for underfunded pensions and then some other liabilities as well that are fairly significant. This is just a quick summary. I won't spend much time on this. This is the summary of the 3 apportionments that RTD has received from the FTA. We knew about the CARES grant in 2020 and drew that all down. That was to maintain service levels during 2020. So $232.3 million, we drew that full amount down. At the time we expended it all and then we draw it down after the fact. So we did have some funding left over, which helped us build up some of our fund balances, which was nice. The CRISA funding, we received that apportionment in January, $203 million. We intend to draw that entire amount down to support transit services during 2021. And then ARPA funding, just on Monday, we received the guidance for that. All of these funds have to be used for maintaining service and paying salaries and wages of operators, as well as purchase transportation, which is paying our contractors to provide service. So it's really a stopgap. The $774 million is to help transit agencies maintain service, at least to a minimum extent throughout this economic downturn. And then my last slide, so this is in thousands. What this is intended to depict, we put this together back in May. We will be updating this. It's the basically the 6-year midterm financial plan with the COVID relief funding that we just looked at added in. The way this graphic works is that the orange bars are expenditures and the gray bars are revenues. So what you can see is we've had some, because of the COVID relief funding that we received in 2020 as well as 2021, that really helped to buoy us in terms of our financial funding sources. So revenues exceeded expenditures, but our intent as an agency is to stretch those out because the future is so uncertain that we're going to use those funds as we draw them down. It's basically replacing sales and use tax funds that were lost in fair revenue. Gives us the ability to keep some of that and spread some of the expenditures over time so that we don't have big disruptions in service. And you can see down in the number chart there at the end, it's almost a break-even proposition when you go out to the end, because we have fluctuations by year, but really we plan on spending all that money through that period. One thing I'd point out here is the 2 footnotes at the bottom. It's important that everybody knows that we have, as I said, our one main thing that we pay first is our debt obligations. So when we get our sales and use taxes, funding is taken out of those monthly tax remittances that we get from the Department of Revenue. It doesn't even come to RTD, it goes straight to a trustee who puts those in a bank account. That is used for paying our debt service on our bonds and our certificates of participation. So we always make sure we pay that first, then whatever's left over is available for service, state of good repair, et cetera. Where that becomes a challenge is right now the base system only has about 10% of their revenues going towards debt service, and the majority of the debt will be paid off on the base system, which is mainly our bus and some of our light rail that was in place before the Fast Tracks initiative. The biggest bond issuance there was for the T-Rex project going down I-25 to the south. That bond funding will be paid off in 2024. So we're close to being out from under a lot of the big debt obligations on the base system side. Where we have a lot of debt, however, is on the Fast Track side from all the build out that we've done. So currently in any given year, about over half of the revenues that come to the Fast Tracks system go to service debt. So that's a huge burden for us. And I bring that up because the base system statutorily can provide funding to Fast Tracks, but Fast Tracks can't provide funding to the base system. That's not a huge deal right now, and it's actually a good thing because of the debt burden on Fast Tracks. But the problem with the base system is that when the debt is paid off, it's subject to Tabor ratchet down restrictions. So the revenue growth will be limited. So it limits the amount that the base can contribute to Fast Tracks. So Holly, I believe that is my last slide. So I'll turn it back.
I think so too. And but I do have a question for you. And I'm hoping, is it all right if we have just a quick moment for questions? I don't know if other people do as well. I did want to ask about this, and the Fast Tracks debt, how I mean, the 55% is obviously a really big number, and it's taking up a lot of the revenue that comes in. And how can you give us a time frame? Because the next thing that we're going to talk about, Simon is going to talk to us about taking this sort of more near term out to the long term. So how far out are we before we get out from under some of that debt, that other debt?
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. So on the Fast Track side, the bonds that we've issued to build all the Fast Tracks projects that have been put in place, those bonds don't expire until 2050 will be our last debt payment on those, 2050. So that's about just under 30 years out. So that debt burden will carry on for quite a while. And it's fairly pretty much the same level every year. So it's about $150 million a year on the Fast Track side that they have to fund to pay their debt service for all this infrastructure. So it's pretty significant. The good news is that debt burden in terms of its overall financial picture on Fast Tracks is as revenues grow, that debt burden, we have all of our debt is fixed interest rate. It fluctuates a little bit by year because we structured it for cash flow purposes and replacement of assets. But up until 2050, as our revenue grows, that 55% should become less of a burden for Fast Track. So it does free up some money over time, but it's still a significant amount of
so if I get that right, you bring in a greater volume from growth in the region, growth in your sales tax revenue, and so the debt becomes a small portion of that. Did I catch that right? Yeah,
absolutely. And so I started with RTD about 11 years ago. Our sales tax collections for both base and Fast Tracks were about 300 million. In 2021, we expect them to be about 683 million. So they more than doubled in the 11 years that I've been here. So yeah, we would expect those to continue to grow as the economy grows.
Perfect. Mike, I see you and I had the same question. Did we cover your question there, Mike?
You did. Thanks.
Okay, good. Okay, I don't see anything else. Doug, that was really helpful. I feel like it's kind of a lot of numbers and kind of a lot to absorb, but we may have more questions. We're
Sounds
sure
good.
to have more questions.
Sounds good. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so next, so that gave us a picture of the next few years and a little bit looking out to that fast track debt service and how much longer that is. Simon Mosbaugh with WSP is on our team, and he's going to join us next and talk just a bit about their approach for helping us understand what that longer term future looks like. So out to the 2030, 2050 timeframe. We don't have the answers to that yet, but he's going to tell us a bit about the process that they're going through and then when they'll be back with more information for us.
Great. Thank you, Holly. Really appreciate that introduction. If you want to move to the next slide. So I'm going to expand on what Doug said, but you won't see any more numbers. So at least there will be a little bit of a time to catch up and get your thoughts and questions for the next discussion. So expanding on what Doug said, we are looking at really building the high-level financial outlook to 2030, so the 10-year horizon, and 2050 to determine what resources will be available for any new projects, for additional service, but also to cover some of the key state of good repair needs that Doug mentioned earlier. So we expect this analysis to be presented to you in the fall, like for preliminary results. And frankly, like Doug said it all, like the key drivers here are really on the cost side, the operating cost for each mode, and of course the question of the service level, I assume for each mode will be essential. The major capital projects that are already committed, as well as the debt service. And I think Doug made it very clear, as well as the last question that you had, Holly, how important it is to consider the debt service as a constraint on future investment. On the revenue side, we have sales tax forecasts for both base and fast track that we will use, of course. The question of what fair revenues we can assume in the medium to long term is also going to be very important and informed by those other discussion on the fares that Doug has mentioned. And we will also, of course, look at other revenues that RTD relies on, that includes, for instance, advertising. So this is just to give you a very high level picture, really in the spirit of what Doug has presented. How do we expand? How do we look at the situation in a 10-year and 30-year horizon? So that will be a key part of what we come back to you in the fall with preliminary results. It's really this long-term financial outlook. So if you want to go to the next slide, Holly. Thank you. So another piece of that you may remember is some recommendation for any opportunities for some process improvements, right? Are there, based on lessons learned from other agencies, are there any opportunities to simplify any financial processes that the agency is using? So that's something we've started looking into and we'll continue refining over the next couple of months with respect to financial plan updates. And we have numerous examples of other agencies that have been growing very fast, like RTDs, that can provide some guidance on that and how they look at their long-term horizon, how often they update their long-term plans, and at what level of detail. Another aspect of the potential for opportunities to make any process more efficient for the agency, if that's possible, is the question of project prioritization. And I think, Holly, you alluded to this earlier. I have a couple of examples on this slide. I'm not going to get into the detail of those, and those are not necessarily exclusive options, but definitely when the resources are finite, you want to the best practice is really to identify the priorities of the agencies, what are the key goals, and then make sure that you have a process to prioritize the projects that are really going to serve your key goals, as well as keep people safe and keep the riders safe on all the modes that are operating. And that includes, of course, like considering the prioritization of state of good repair projects. And one way this can be done is to make sure that the agency does connect as they've been doing all their needs, and then turn that into a fiscally constrained plan that include the prioritization of projects. So Holly, that's really and everyone, that's really a high-level overview of what's coming. Again, we don't have more numbers, and I think we've had a very clear explanation from Doug on the next 6 years already. So I don't know if you want to go into any questions or more detail. I saw one question pop up, Holly.
Yeah, there is a quick question up here, and I don't know if we have the answer to this on the fly, but I think it's a good one for us to make sure we have a good answer to them when we come back. Our estimated growth in the federal sources, so things like 5307. And I think those are important, and understanding where those are headed is always a little tricky.
Yeah, and so our revenue in a normal year is $1 billion. So we're currently forecasting about $850 million with the COVID, with the loss in fair revenue in particular. But on a regular year, we typically receive $80 million, right around $80 million in 5307 formula grant funds, and those are for preventive maintenance. Those don't tend to grow a whole lot year over year. However, because we've added new services, we do expect some growth in those 5307 funds. The way it works with FTA is for instance, a new rail line has to be in place for 7 years. Then you get the preventive maintenance grant funding in year 8. So I would expect the W line opened in 2013, I believe. So I think next year in 2022, we'll start getting some 5307 preventive maintenance grants for that. Then we'll get more as we hit that 8-year threshold for the other lines that were open. So we will get some growth, and we will project that in, but it's not huge.
One thing, if I may add, really quick, Doug and Holly, because I think it's a great question. We'll also be looking at the reauthorization following the FAST Act, which should hopefully program some high-level, at least authorization of increases on the formula funds in the next maybe 5 years. At this point, all the eyes are on the hill, so we don't have more on this. But of course, as changes become available, we will be integrating them into the analysis.
Yeah, that's super. Thank you. So I'm guessing there will be lots of questions as we move through this process. So Doug and Simon, we appreciate your time, and we'll see you back here in a couple of months with more details.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay, so next item up is wanting to talk about what is the process we use for how do we best plan for future mobility needs and trends? And this is really talking about understanding that the world is always changing and our travel patterns are changing. And even before COVID, we had things that we thought were particularly disruptive, like Uber and Lyft. Little did we know what real disruption was, right? But we always are looking to the future and trying to make good plans for the agency. And this process is intended to help us do that. So this is the start of the scenario planning process. So the next slide down, these are the results. We had about 30 people respond to the survey. Thank you to those of you who did. And the intent here, we just gave you a few tickler items on what we thought would be driving forces that would impact RTD's ability to respond to and attract riders to their system. And some more than others, and some are more uncertain, and their impact and how much impact they have on RTD varies as well. So this is a chart of your results from those that took the survey. So the level of uncertainty going up to the right. So if we get all the way over to the 100 level, we feel that it is completely uncertain. We have no way of knowing what's going to happen. And on the impact side, if it goes all the way up to 100, we think it has a tremendous impact on RTD's ability to capture ridership and respond to future mobility needs. So what we see there, I think, I love this. The top right, of course, is funding. And I think funding is, so we're looking for those driving forces that are up in that top right quadrant. And funding is probably the one that stands out the most in that category. I think funding is an interesting one because it impacts the level of service you're able to provide. It impacts number 9, your workforce availability. How much money you have to offer service certainly has a big impact on that. Now it gets a little messier when we go down into these other ones, but others that stand out to me, 10 and 11, how much local government support you have. This is land use, first and last mile that local agencies would put in. State and federal policy is in here. Number 4 talks about disruptive technologies. And then 9 is that workforce availability, which I think is an important one as well. As you know, when we started the project in 2019, there were 2 large issues looming over RTD: workforce availability, and the fact that they were actually running more service than was sustainable over time. So you might remember when we started the system optimization process, we were going in with a budget that was smaller than the amount of service that RTD was providing at that time. We were at I want to say like a 90% mark. And that has dropped even further from that. So I think these are interesting driving forces. If we want to just go, the results are really interesting, and I think in line with something very useful for us to think about how we frame scenarios. Here are some that people wrote in. We asked if you thought that there were other ones. A couple of them that came up were fares, fuel cost, climate change and climate change mandates, system optimization, which I think is again right in line with that. How much money do you actually even have to provide service? But look at that one, that was a 90 and a 95 in uncertainty. And that's just one person that provided that feedback. So I guess in the interest of time, here's what I'd like to do. I want to tell you what I'm trying to get to here is for us to flag 2, maybe 3 key driving forces that you think are particularly important for RTD to consider as they plan for the future. So I want you to have these in the back of your mind, these 12 that we have on here, as well as those that were entered by through the survey. And then I want us to go ahead and move over to the Cambridge team to have them tell us a little bit about the travel demand modeling tool that they refer to as EMAT. And this tool is really going to help us use some, rather than us just speculating about what changes in mobility might occur in the region, the tool really helps us nail down what those mobility changes might look like. I think can be really very informative to the scenario planning. So let's dive into that, and we'll come back to what driving forces we think are most important for RTD to consider.
Great, thanks, Holly. So yeah, as Holly mentioned, we are working with this tool called the Exploratory Modeling and Analysis Tool, or EMAT, and it really allows us to use a data-driven process that's based on observed information, transit ridership, onboard surveys, household surveys that have been conducted to get a sense of what uncertainties really look like. This tool lets us vary a number of inputs, and then we can see how that might affect some of what we call outputs. In here, the inputs we've identified for this exercise start with service levels. There are 2 pieces to that. One is workforce. If we don't have enough drivers, then we need to reduce the assumptions about the frequency of service, for example. But also funding availability and anything else that might change the amount of service that RTD is able to provide. And we can see how changing that amount of service that's out there can change a number of these outputs. We can also, of course, want to look at telework or work from home. That's certainly a big issue now with COVID and people returning to work, but maybe not full time. Micromobility is another big issue. I know Denver just signed a contract with 2 scooter providers. There are others in the suburbs and elsewhere in the region. Those have a big impact on how people use transit. It might replace short transit trips with direct scooter trips, but it also provides better first and last mile access. So it can start to understand how changing the access levels in those short trips can impact transit ridership and other things. And the last one we have listed here for this exercise is parking costs. And we're looking at it in 2 places. One is parking cost at your destination. If parking costs go up, that can impact transit ridership and possibly bring it up. But also there's talk of potentially additional charging at park and rides, so we can start to see how that might affect those drive to transit trips. On the output side, we look at a number of things. This list may continue to grow and change over the next month as we really nail these down. But some of the key outputs are just simply ridership by mode, the mode share, what percentage of trips are made on transit, particularly in the peak hour, maybe commute trips. We can look at station area access. We want to look at the vehicle miles and hours of travel, but more importantly, the person miles of travel and the person hours of travel, and then break those down by transit and auto to see what's happening. We also can look at things like trip lengths, transit travel time, or transit competitiveness, the ratio of the amount of time it takes to make a trip on transit versus auto, and see how that changes. And the last in this list, but certainly not the least important, is equity areas. We want to make sure as we look at these different inputs, we're monitoring those equity groups, and we want to make sure that we're not adversely affecting any of those groups. If we look at the next slide, this will show you an example from an EMAT application in another area that allows us to look at a set of variables. In this case, we're starting with the outputs, and we've set it up here to look at outputs that show a higher share of transit use. After we select that, we can go on to our next slide, and we'll zoom in on one of the outputs. On the next slide, there it is. So here we can see that on the left, we have an orange bar that is going down as you move to the right. And this is an exercise that was done with increased telecommuting. Now, we didn't go to COVID levels of telecommuting, so we're not seeing that 70% reduction in transit. We're assuming a lot of the other stuff goes back to a little bit more normal. And we're also looking out quite a ways into the future, about 2045 in this particular region. But you can see with less telecommuting, we'd expect to have greater transit share. And with higher telecommuting, we are seeing less transit share. This isn't just higher or fewer scenarios with transit ridership, it's the share, the percent of overall trips made on transit. If you click to the next setting here, I want to point out that on the left, even with very low levels of telecommuting, we still have scenarios with low transit share. But conversely, even with high telecommuting, we have scenarios with higher transit share. So there's this balance that we're not just looking at this in a vacuum. We're looking at all of the different inputs that we selected, understanding how they interact. And this allows us to look at the robustness of different scenarios that we'll look at and understand certain scenarios may not be as sensitive to some of these input variables as others. And if you move on to the next slide, I think this is my last slide, if I remember correctly. This is an example of how we can look not just at telecommuting, but in this particular case, our inputs or our uncertainties were things like connected and autonomous vehicles, TNCs, demographics, the transit network, and telecommuting. We would replace these, of course, with the variables I mentioned above and be able to see how each of these is related to some of those input or output selections that we chose on the first screen. I think this tool is going to be really fun to work with. We're currently building all of this up. And I think it's really going to provide a lot of input as we're trying to do planning in this time of uncertainty and account for those uncertainties that Holly mentioned.
That's super. Thanks, Sean. Okay, so here's what we're trying to get to. Sean and his team are going to have a lot of data for us. And with that much data, it can be a bit overwhelming in trying to identify how RTD best responds to this. So what I'm hoping we can do today, while we are fresh with that EMAT conversation and the tools and the inputs that we have to work with from Sean in Cambridge, as well as the discussion that we had about the driving forces and the survey that you took, I'm hoping we can have a conversation and narrow it down to a couple of driving forces that you think are particularly important for RTD to explore to ensure that the outcome of this study allows them to be resilient and responsive to the future. So one of them that I'm going to throw out there that I think is a no-brainer, but you tell me if you think I'm wrong, is the funding. Because I think the funding is so instrumental in how the level of service, we can talk about the level of service that's provided. It addresses the workforce issues. Obviously, funding is just has such a huge influence on what RTD is able to do. I would put funding in that mix. I'd like to hear from others what other driving forces you think are particularly important. And we can go back up to the graph if you'd like to see that. Did somebody else want to throw out funding? Maybe I took the straw man, I guess.
So put your comments in chat, raise your hand. We really love, this is the opportunity for you guys to do a little work for us. So you see where Holly's trying to get. By defining these scenarios, it's really giving us that future look that we can really do a lot of analysis. This tool is fantastic. It's going to give us so much information, but we've got to kind of frame the big drivers. It doesn't mean that we can't look at some of these other aspects. We absolutely will. But what are the things that are really going to drive it? So maybe we start with well, we got a comment from Andrew. Can you please, Holly, help us define how you use competition?
Yeah, so we did competition in this particular case was referring to other transportation providers. So this is sort of the influence, but it could be other things too, of the Ubers and Lyfts and other transportation providers in our industry coming in. And, you know, before COVID, we spent a lot of time talking about how potentially ridership was dropping because there was competition from other providers. So that's what I have in my mind when we're talking about competition. Local government support, and I think local government support, I think those land use decisions go hand in hand in that. First and last mile. Workforce availability.
Comment from Fred about workforce availability.
Yep.
And support from land use.
Parking costs.
Parking costs. Yeah.
So one thing I would say, and I don't know if I'm hoping that we have somebody from Dr. Cog with us today. Let's scroll through.
I don't see anybody.
Shoot, I don't see anybody from Dr. Cog, but one thing that came up the last time we met as a group, we talked about Dr. Cog's all of the scenario planning that they had done, which is a different tool and a different style of scenario planning, but they have a lot of really great information for us about land use decisions. They also have a lot of information on fare policies that we can pull forward. So I think we should absolutely pull forward and use that information to the best of our ability to inform this Reimagine process. I think those are good ones. David, do you want to talk a little bit about your comment?
Yeah, I mean, land use, I think, is part of it. Every time a building is built, there's what gets built, but there's also what the impact is to the transportation system. So if local governments are just dumping more travel onto the existing road system and either aren't widening the roads or aren't prioritizing transit, such as Dr. Cog's MetroVision saying we're going to build 10 BRT corridors by 2050, then transit's going to be slow and people won't choose it.
That's good. What do you all think about the telework and the fact that we have a lot of people that are choosing to, have a different work schedule or not go to the office, work from home?
I think that relates to Matt Cowson's comment that he just put in. Matt, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Thank you, Julie. It just strikes me as these driving forces really relate to a supply or a provision of parameters. And my comment relative to activity centers, office centers, the places of activity that will, I guess you could actually partition it into the laptop privilege class and more the essential workers, frontline workers. What is the extent that those are animated and come back to pre-pandemic levels to really serve as a cause for transit delivery services?
That's an excellent point.
Ooh, Andrew, I like the walkability. you want to speak up on that a bit?
Sure. Yeah, I was just thinking that, you know, I think it's critical for the success of transit and someone, you know, wrote in here that competition could be complementary. Well, I think, you know, as transit competes with walking, let's say on the mall, it competes all the time. The buses, you know, bus ridership competes with people walking in this beautiful granite walkway, right? So, but I think as you get further out of the urban core, you get to areas where walkability really does impede your ability to get people on those transit facilities or to those transit services. So yeah, I just see that as a critical function of transit. And there are areas where it doesn't, you know, it just doesn't exist. You can't get from one place, you know, to a transit stop that's, you know, less than 100 yards away because of some barrier.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Okay.
Fred, you're obviously keeping us on track on the workforce. Would you like to talk a little bit about that? So that's obviously a significant issue for us right now.
Sure. One of the real challenges that we have is that the skilled labor workforce has really changed over the years. When I started as an operator 35 years ago, you didn't even get a job unless you had a CDL, you know, and you didn't get a job as a mechanic unless you were a journeyman experienced mechanic. Now, I think I've hired 3 journeyman mechanics in the 3 years that I've been here. So our biggest source of mechanics is actually going to trade schools where they have basic skills such as automotive repair, and then we train them to be diesel mechanics. Our operators come in the door with no commercial experience. We train them, help them get a CDL. Body shop. On the body shop side, I have hired 2 experienced body shop technicians in 3 years. So that will tell you just how challenging it is to get a skilled workforce. And then you top on it, the majority of our operators are baby boomers. They're coming of age. They're going to be retiring soon. Our workforce is going to dwindle even more. So finding labor that can actually fill these critical positions is challenging. Right now, this year, we have been hiring since February. I have been able to successfully hire 46 operators. I need 72 operators between now and next week to be able to make the September run board. So this will tell you how challenging it is for us. Even if I've got money, if I've got resources to pay for this, I've got equipment. If I don't have anybody to drive a bus, to clean it, to fix it, to repair it, I don't make pull-up.
Got it. Thank you, Fred. That was great context.
Yeah, those are good.
Other thoughts? So we've got a few rising to the top, it looks like. Definitely this sort of local land use and local government policy decisions. We've got workforce. We've got funding we've already talked about. But to Holly's point, you know, what if you guys had to narrow it down? You know, if we had to get to 2, maybe 3 at the absolute, what, you know, if we agree funding is one, and I haven't seen anybody disagree, push back on that. Obviously, funding is a big one. You know, if you really had to narrow it down to really drive this, what would you guys think?
Well, and I wonder, Julie, as I'm thinking about these, I kind of like the idea of framing it for, especially in the EMAT tool, at service levels, because I think, you know, to Fred's point about even if he has money, sometimes he doesn't have enough operators. We could do, if we do service levels, we could have high service levels, like assume that, you know, in one scenario, on one side, you have adequate funding, high service, and you have the workforce to support it. And on the other side, you don't have the workforce and you have low, and subsequently you have low service levels, you know, which would be a lower funding scenario, not necessarily in a good manner. You might be able to come up with funding, but it maybe is not, it's not it's not doing what you need it to do, you know? So maybe it's the varying of service gives us a better, from a scenario perspective, and it's sort of a surrogate for funding.
Yeah, Holly, if I can chime in, that's exactly what EMAT is built to help us with. We can slide the funding, if you will, the service levels. We want to enhance, build out our route system as best we can. But if we don't have the drivers to drive the buses and the trains, and we don't have the workforce to keep them in good repair, then we can't run them as frequently. So we can see how those two things interact. If we can get both, great. If we get neither, and then what happens if we get one or the other? So that's a perfect example of how this tool will help us understand things.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And then I see on the, Phil put in the teleworking trends. And I do think, you know, when we go out of, I do think it's perhaps right now the biggest unknown right now that I think the EMAT tool can also help us with and understand what happens if we go, I mean, just to be extreme, which it doesn't look like this is happening, but just to be extreme, you know, if everybody decided the laptop class, we call them the laptop class, all want to work from home, you know, 4 out of 5 days a week, or, you know, everybody decides they do want to go back to the office. I mean, those are pretty extremes, and how RTD responds and how they capture ridership those are different. Your solutions and your recommendations are different. And understanding those seems like it's pretty important. And I think we can get good information from the tool for that as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Andrew had a comment about narrowing competition to drive-only users. I think that's interesting. Andrew, would you like to talk about that?
Please do.
Sure. Yeah, I think somewhere in here we should capture the competition between just, you know, traditional drive alone users in order to really weigh that, weigh the mode shift benefit, I guess, of getting people from cars into transit. And I think that's where, you know, a lot of people, if we're talking to employers and employees, that's typically how they're weighing their decision around transit. Sometimes it's around biking and walking, you know, whether they want to shift to using transit, but typically it's, I'm not going to drive anymore. I'm going to use the bus or use the train because it's more convenient, or I can, you know, it's a little less time on the longer peak in the afternoon or something like that.
That's a great point.
Yeah, that's interesting. I like that. Mm-hmm. Okay, here's what I'm going to suggest. I think we have some really good feedback here that we can move forward with. What I'd like to suggest is that we talk to the advisory committee tomorrow and get some perspective from them as well. And that we, as a follow-up to this meeting, maybe as part of our minutes, and when we follow up in a week or so, that we provide you our suggested approach based on what we've heard from you, if that works for everybody. Because I would, before we land anything completely, I'd like to hear from the advisory committee. And then I'd also like to weave in the other tools and information we have available from Dr. Cog, which I think is an important piece of the puzzle as well. And that I think has the opportunity to cover the land use side of the equation. So let me do a little recon on that, and we'll get back to you if that sounds okay. So no pressure on you out there, Sean, but we're really hoping that at the next meeting that we will be able to see those EMAT results and talk about what those future scenarios actually look like. So this will be when we move the levers left and right for these various scenarios, how does that change ridership, the mode share, station area access, the vehicle miles of travel, all those good things that Sean talked about. And there's a lot of data that can come out of the model and from the EMAT tool. We'll probably need to narrow it down a bit to what is most pertinent to us. But our goal will be to provide you some of those results at the next meeting. I think it's really interesting. I had an opportunity to talk to several other agencies who have used this EMAT tool, and they've had some really good success helping them generate future plans and understanding the sort of dynamic and changing future we're in. So I'm excited about that. And then I mentioned this earlier, our goal here is to then say, how does RTD respond? How do you respond to this future to make sure that you are fiscally responsible, you're efficient, you're resilient, you're sustainable over the long haul, because you understand these very varying futures that you might have, and the dynamic future. So again, potentially some challenging conversations, but let's shore up for those and plan to come in and have some really productive dialogue around current commitments, the workforce structure, what changes need to happen there, and then operational enhancements, what that might look like, and then talking about current policies and how we might respond to those future scenarios. All right, any questions in the moment? It looks like there's a couple of location neutral jobs. Okay, there's some good references that Fred's provided in the chat. Thank you, Fred. I'll take a look at those when we get further. So in just from our last, let's go into the RTD as a mobility integrator. We had some great conversation last time about RTD being we took a Menti survey, and we said on one side, RTD is an integrator, and on the other side, RTD is a full service provider, and they provide scooters, and they provide bike share, and they provide all sorts of great things. And we asked you to help us narrow down where you felt RTD belonged in that spectrum. So on the next slide, you'll see that we have, these are the results of that. On the left side, it's the technical working group. On the right side, it's the advisory committee. Both of you landed more towards being the integrator rather than a full service provider. This is pretty consistent with what we've heard from the public as well. So I think this is a great area for us to use this as a launching point to start to identify and define more clearly what it really means for RTD to be an integrator moving into the future. So Amy's going to give us a quick overview on the work she's doing to help define that.
Thanks, Holly. And, you know, I think that we'd like to show you guys this chart and talk a little bit about what we're doing. As you know, we're working on sort of the future of mobility at RTD. What does a future transit agency look like? What defines the role of an integrator? And when we talk about integration, they're really about three primary roles that you see sort of weaving together in how this works. The first off is how a transit agency is positioned to use its governance, its analytics, its capacity as an operator, its capacity as a partner, if you will, to be able to drive these things. So the first is looking at how you build across the different partnerships. Who are part of those partnerships, whether it's the operators themselves, to the private operators, to our corporate partners, to our TMAs and others, as well as our communities. The ultimate piece of integration is really about how do you integrate the customer service? How do you integrate the role of the customer in accessing the different types of mobility services there are? This is often a line that a lot of people ascribe to MOS, the mobility as a service system, really that customer service layer. And this is an area in which RTD has really been doing quite a bit, but it is clearly broader than just RTD. What does it mean to attach the availability of all mobility services? How do you think about the routing of those services, the booking, the account systems, how people go on and off those systems, how you price it, pay it, and ultimately how you analyze those systems? The last piece of integration is really about the mobility services themselves. And in this chart, you see three different categories of what mobility services could be. High capacity services. And when we say that, we're talking about BRTs, rail, our high capacity lines like Colfax, et cetera. But we're also talking about mid-capacity services. And that isn't just mobility services that are provided by the transit agencies. So mid-sized buses, et cetera, but shuttle systems, link services, even first mile, last mile services, integrator and shuttle services within certain geo-specific areas and the like. And then what we're going to call micro capacity. So that's individual rides, some shared rides, let's say on Lyfts and Ubers, as well as micro mobility services that are shared fleet services like scooters, bikes, and the like. So as we go through this process, as you know, we've been telling you that we're working on reports that look at mobility as a service, parking, and first and last mile. But within that, we are going to be evaluating, according to this sort of integration kind of tool, what does the RTD internal service structure look like? how do you really think about the elevation of customer service platforms in MOS? Where does that fit within the agency, and how do you really organize that? What are the policies that influence this ability to be an integrator? What are the policies that look at maybe not land use per se, but parking and the integration of payment systems, and how do those fit within local service, local intent maybe to provide more universal mobility services to their residents and others? What's the impact of regulations? And then really, how do we define the expectations and the partnerships? So these are the pieces that we're going to be getting into. We hope that also then in the fall that we'll be able to come to you with a framework that outlines that integration, outlines where parking, where mobility on demand, where mobility as a service, and that physical infrastructure integration fits in this kind of construct. So that's what we're going to be looking at as we move forward. And happy if any of you look at this and say, gosh, when I think of integration, mobility integration, I think you're missing something. So happy to have you guys comment in the chat as you look at this very simplistic, if you will, chart to say, integrator means something else to us and how we think about what that looks like. So as you do that, I'll flip to the next slide and talk a little bit about some of the tactical tools that are feeding this integration mode. And I know it might be redundant from some of those who participated in, but we wanted to retrack to Mobility Choice Blueprint. And as you know, Mobility Choice Blueprint was a collaborative strategy that was led in the metro region that really looked at how do we prepare for the changing and rapidly changing technology that's, revolutionizing mobility. And it was a combination partnership between DRCOG and CDOT and RTD and the Denver Metro Chamber. And as you know, it was coordinating a strategic direction that pulled all of these mobility needs together, looked at some of the technologies and the implications for mobility, and sort of set the path for what those new mobility partnerships could look like. And there was a next piece to that now, which some of you are participating in, which is the Advanced Mobility Partnership, which is taking that framework and now starting to talk about how do we tackle the implementation of it. We wanted to frame for you guys today because it is an important piece to understand some of the tactical actions that came off of Mobility Choice Blueprint, what it means in that integrator framework, and the areas that we are going to be building in tactically that will go into some of these recommendations as we go forward. And so I won't get into reading all of them because you can certainly sit and look at them. But when we talk about regional collaboration and what it means to really look at public-private partnerships, for instance, that are beyond just infrastructure construction, but what does it mean in mobility services, for instance? How do we look at the system optimization? What does that mean, David, you mentioned, BRT corridors, for instance, coming off of DRCOG, but also what does transit prioritization mean at the local level? And then how do we think about shared mobility services? And this is one that a lot of discussion has gone around, universal mobility apps. What does it mean to do something as a region? What does it mean to do third-party partnerships with other integrators and the like? How do we think about neighborhood scale mobility hubs like the one that, for instance, City and County of Denver is about to build on 38th and Blake, which would be their first. So these tools are going to also be implemented, included in some of that integration piece. But Mike, I noticed that you make a comment about if RTD is neither integrator nor for full service provider, what if a stronger competitor gets to the integrator role first, and then RTD just does the service side? And I think that that actually is one of the questions tactically that we are working on and talking about with RTD is right now, if you look at it, RTD has sort of a two-pronged approach when it comes to integration, some of which they are doing in-house. And I'm talking specifically now about that customer integration on that platform side, the MOS side. Some of it they're building in-house with different platforms and different apps and tools, but some of it they are very much going with third parties to help support the level of integration with the customers using transit app, for instance, collaborating with Uber, collaborating with Lyft on planning and trip planning and even ticketing options. And so the question being is, do they continue on that two-pronged approach, or do they shift to one or the other as a fulfillment of that integrator kind of role? And those are some of the questions that we're asking. But I'd love, Mike, if you wanted to delve into that question.
Well, and Amy, I would just for clarification, I guess I'm curious from your perspective. I feel like both of those prongs that you talked about, even when you're talking about third party, have an integrator umbrella for RTD to participate in. Is that true?
Yes, it is. Because at the core of it, RTD is always responsible for the bus service and the rail service and allowing those passengers and those customers to use that service. So at no point is RTD ever out of the mix. As you mentioned, Mike, there's always that base core service. They also have to have the data interface to be able to allow for a third party to interact with the system that they are providing. So I think that, yes, RTD is always a part of that. But yes, as we go through this, I think that one of the things that we are very much focused on, again, is when we say integrator, again, what does that mean? What kind of dollars go into that? Who leads what activity when you look at those three categories that we outlined in the previous chart? Partnerships, customer interface, and service. Thanks.
Other thoughts? Or Mike, did you want to follow up? I didn't want to suggest I didn't want you to follow up. I was just looking for a little clarification.
Yeah, I just, there was just a little too much sound like this is inevitable. I mean, I get that a bunch of people in two different groups said they thought this might be a good idea, but I don't think this is in any way inevitable that RTD takes on this role. So it's possible that there will be someone else, I don't know, CDOT, Google, you know, the Holly company that Holly sets up to become a billionaire when this is done, is actually the one who is getting information from RTD about its service and where its bus is and when it will arrive and how fast the train is moving and whether there's a delay. And then someone else is doing the integrating. And so I'm on my little handheld computer, but I'm not at the RTD app, I'm somewhere else. And I can get to the information I need about a bus or a train, but I'm getting scooter information from Lime, not RTD. And RTD isn't the one that's integrating the Lime information and the bus information. That's Holly's billion-dollar company or whoever. So I just don't think it's inevitable that RTD will have these roles, particularly given the front end of the meeting where they don't pay off debts until 2050. So how do you fund this thing you're going to be if you don't have the borrowing capacity to build the financial and computer and infrastructure to become this thing? And I can't imagine RTD is interested in getting into the full service. I mean, you don't want to take over Lime, I don't think, or Jump or
no. And I do think that was pretty clear from the conversation, like not going to that far end. Brian, I see you have a hand up.
Yeah, Mike's point is a good one. And it was part of the impetus for the mobility choice blueprint and something that we need to define as part of Reimagine RTD. The thought that you could have Uberville, where one giant company gets massive market power and creates a walled garden where the only way you can get to certain services is to go through their app. Mm-hmm. This has been talked about. Amy Ford can tell you about how this has been a prospect in other places where the public sector wants to make sure, as it's the term David Zipper uses, where he says the disintermediation between you and your customer. And do we want to see a future where the primary way that people not only get to car share and bikes and scooters and parking and go right down the list, as well as our own services, slips away from us, and we lose some of that ability to be the integrator. So Mike, really, really good point. It's shaking out in different places, and we're not really sure what the outcome could be, but we want this group to help us plant a flag on where we think we should take a stand. Thanks.
So I'm loving that. I appreciate everybody's input, but I do want to keep us on track here. So we may have to circle back around on that a bit at our next meeting. We do have some updates that I think are pretty important, and the group will give us, I think these will be fairly fast. Cliff, if you're out there, can you give us a very brief update on the electrification task?
I will try to go fast, and I'll also be a bit of a Debbie Downer that all of the electrification is going to affect whatever the mobility of the future is going to be. And, sort of a short preview to the downer side of this is it could very well be a constraint about how you know, a constraining force, both in terms of accelerating the funding constraint need, as well as a service provision need that Fred talks about. So we'll get into that later, but so what we're doing right now is we're coordinating with the facilities team where we can for their electrification assessments. What they're doing now is going out in the field, I think next week, and begin to look at the facilities. But as part of that, sort of killed two birds with one visit, basically. They'll look at the electrification assessments, and we'll build that into our work as well. A little bit of confusion about the memo versus the presentation. You're going to get the presentation about our approach in a few minutes. We will certainly turn that into a narrative as well about what our approach memo or what our approach assumptions are going to be in the modeling methodology. So that we're doing that. I expect I can get that to you by the end of the week, a draft of it, at least for your comments. And then, you know, just to stipulate in that modeling methodology, we're going to look at 2019 data because that's the best data we've got available. And so the performances will be about the route network and how it performs on the 2019 route network. We'll do what we can to accommodate and adjust for that, and at least in terms of costs and some of the other things, outputs of the modeling that would be needed to cost out, say, the network of the future. We can get into that in the Q&A if you want. And then we'll finalize our analyses and implementation sort of recommendations of how best to do this for the 2030 horizon. Again, answering the question, what can we do by then? And then what will it take, big numbers, to achieve a 2050 full electrification by 2050. So that's, you know, we still are working from those assumptions. Now, based on what I just said, electrification goes well beyond just sticking a bus out there and hoping to see how far it goes before the battery dies. I mean, it has a number of other implications that you can see. It's just not just the charging strategies and the battery size, but also the how to do best the route phasing, the electrification demand. All these things are sort of an onion, and they are all interrelated, and modeling gets at some of that. So next slide, please. This is how our model works. We start out, it's called a lightning bolt, and we start out with some varying inputs that will get, first of all, a performance assessment of that 2019 route structure, and then a deeper dive of our approach, either using lightning bolt or bolt. I think because of the constrained schedule, it will probably still be a version of lightning bolt. We'll look at our alternative charging and technology analyses, particularly as they're projected out to 2050, any minor service adjustments that could help. And then finally, we're not going to use bolt, but a refinement in lightning bolt as much as we can provide for demand charge management integration and to get at the cost estimates, et cetera, that we also are charged to do. So with that in mind, the inputs are as follows, and you can just keep clicking as we go here. You know, we're going to take, using GTFS data, 2019 data, the existing schedule. The next slide. And then those inputs keep growing. The vehicle, the charging, the battery, the ridership estimates can drive some of this. The divisional locations will obviously drive some of this. And then also the deadhead trips from those trips also work into how far these can go and where we need to put opportunity chargers in order to make the block completion work. Next slide. So those are all the inputs. And then what we measure is a state of charge using where the stops are. We also input the topography and elevation. In Lightning Bolt, what we do is we try to account for that in a range, a safety range of basically the charging rates and the charging curves. We build in a safety buffer, in other words, in order to get to those range estimates and those cost estimates that will be driven out of the range estimates. And we account for all these things like HVAC, the stops, as I mentioned, the elevation, which are pretty severe in a lot of the route structure, the service area of Denver. And then we also look at battery capacities, not only right now, but we try to project where those battery capacities will be in 2050 and in 2030 in order to get, again, cost estimates, range estimates, et cetera. So that's what we measure. And the outputs will be basically the kinds of costs for the vehicles, the kinds of costs for the charging infrastructure, and the kinds of costs for the facility modifications that will interact with the facilities team. And we get the block and the route completion percentage, the performance of the vehicle using the route network, any vehicle performance completion ratios that will be driven by the fact that these don't make the range, and then how best to transition the phasing of this based on some of the simulations that we do, but also which garages to start with in the infrastructure planning and the bus fleet management plan. So what you'll see out of the model will be some graphs that look a little bit like this. We'll do route views and we'll do fleet summary views for the block completion or fleet completion rates. And you know, these are from another presentation. They're not RTD specific yet, but they'll look like that. Also the challenges, we will give you moderate and optimistic ranges. And so you'll get graphs that look a little bit like this as well. And then you'll get graphs that will look like this as well. Electricity and hydrogen consumption and the time of day of those consumptions. So those will be some of the outputs as well. And as I said, we'll also do graphs that look something like this about sort of the 2030 threshold and then the 2050 threshold, horizon, I mean. So that's what we're in the throes of. Now, simultaneous to the performance estimates, we're also doing a sort of rough schedule. We've already started that, a phasing schedule for each of the divisions and the service areas. It's just, at this point, all it is kind of a straw man. It's just, it will be adjusted and refined based on these modeling assumptions and modeling outputs. And it will also, what we'll also do are cost estimates and capital cost estimates and operating cost estimates that will feed into Simon's financial estimates over time, as you know, he had indicated before. With that, any questions?
Cliff, there is a comment, a question in the chat that you may or may not be able to answer. Is RTD eligible to seek funding from the new Electrification enterprise created from the Sustainable Transportation Act?
Yes, I believe so. And we'll look into that in terms of funding. That's kind of one of the last reports that we'll give you are eligible funding opportunities for the electrification. In state funding opportunities and public-private partnerships, if that works, as well as federal opportunities based on some of the things that Simon mentioned before. And including outside of transportation. We'll also look at DOE funding opportunities as well.
Oh, yeah, that's great. Thank you. Anybody else? Any other questions? I don't see anything else in the chat. I don't see any hands up. So if there's not, thank you, Cliff.
One more.
Okay.
From Mike. Yep.
Go ahead.
Given the likelihood of severe non-attainment for ozone and our climate change-driven air and quality and water problems, electrification is a very important part of Reimagine. So just reinforcing that, that this is a thing to look at. And then Deborah Basket has a comment suggesting researching state funding opportunities as well as you're looking.
Absolutely.
Criteria.
Absolutely.
Great comments.
Yeah. That's all I had for now. Over to Jules and Carrie.
Yes, super. Thanks, you, Cliff. All right, now we've got a facilities update. We've got some graphics illustrating where they're headed with that. So I'm not sure if it's Jules or Carrie that is leading us off here.
It's going to be Carrie.
Wonderful. Thanks, Carrie.
No problem. If we can go, yeah, there we go. All right, perfect. So as Cliff alluded to, the main focus of our bus facility work at this time is twofold. We're going to advise on site improvement priorities and, that are needed to maintain a state of good repair. And we're also going to investigate the possibility of site electrification for battery electric buses. And then we'll advise, as a result of that, we'll advise on the challenges and opportunities that are posed by each site. We'll also have rail people on site at two of the facilities. Their scope is somewhat different. They're going to be looking at the current capacity of each facility and then determine how that capacity may be affected by an increase in ridership and then advise on that. Actually, if we go back to the previous slide, I'm sorry, we're not quite there yet. So with those drawings in hand, sorry, I've skipped ahead. We've been developing some drawings and we're going to get to those drawings very shortly. But we're going to be on site with drawings that we've developed. We're going to be on site next week to look at a variety of things. We're going to be looking at the state, anything that affects the state of good repair and anything that affects the current operations of the facility. So we're going to be looking specifically at building envelopes, the roof, the walls, the HVAC systems, the site pavement, the plumbing. We're also going to have the 2020 TAMP plan that was issued or sent to the FTA. That in that it identifies some project priorities, I think out to 2025, and they are sort of divided by each facility. And so we're going to look at each of those and just sort of verify, see if we can add to it, see if we can comment on those priorities. Simultaneously, we're going to be looking at possibilities for battery electrification on each site. So we're going to be seeing, what is it on each site that would either make battery electrification more difficult or easier or what have you. So we'll be looking at a variety of things on the site. We're going to be confirming the bus types, the bus quantities. So are we, do we have 40-foot buses? Do we have a mixture of 40-foot and 60-foot buses? We're going to be looking at parking orientation. We're going to be looking at the clear height for interior parking. So what is our measurement from floor to underside of structure? We're going to be looking at the location, obviously, of electrical utilities, where they might be available, how we could possibly run from one place to another. We're going to be looking for outdoor parking areas. We're going to be looking at storm sewer locations because that can affect where we dig, if we dig, or even if digging is a viable strategy. And then on top of that, we're just going to be out there to find out anything that we just don't know. There's a lot of things. We haven't been to the site. We have drawings and we have satellite imagery, and that's what we've been operating on to date. But there's going to be a variety of things that we just don't know based on the limited information that we have right now, and we're hoping to get everything sort of filled in by our site trip next week. So now we can go to the next drawing, if you don't mind. So this is an example of the types of drawings that we'll be producing. This is an in-progress drawing, but it's the type of analysis drawings that we'd be able to, that we would have in the final report. And what we're looking at is East Metro, and we're looking at the site circulation drawing. And so that's going to affect exactly how the orientation of the buses come into the space and then how we can charge them. And where opportunities we might have for locating electrical equipment inside the facility. Without disrupting the facility flow and maintaining service levels. And you can go to the next one. And so then this is Boulder. And we're going to be looking, we're going to be looking at site circulation here particularly because it's very confusing. There is, we have site circulation where we think we're parking in one direction, and then we have bus handlers coming in and then fueling it and then parking in the opposite direction for pull out in the evening. And so we kind of want to verify that because that's going to affect what space we can use and how we're actually going to be able to electrify the buses, we believe, and we'll get to that drawing in just a second as well. But it has, you know, if we're doing sort of a reverse parking system here, as we're showing with buses parked in different directions, it's going to affect how we electrify those buses. Next one. And so then this is Platt, and we're going to be, and it's, again, this is a site flow analysis. And so we want to verify, we have a large stripe of empty space that we want to kind of verify if that actually exists within the actual main parking structure here. We also, at the top of the screen, we want to verify that we have as much spare and empty space that we do. We don't know that we do, we kind of doubt it, but that's what we're showing right now. And this facility also has several ground-mounted chargers, and we want to look at those. We want to take a look at how those are electrified, where that electricity is coming from, and how that may influence future electrification. And so then we went into possibilities. This is back to East Metro, and so then we're looking at how we can possibly electrify these things. And this is just one option, and we have to verify if this is a realistic option. What we're showing here is that on the right side of the bus parking, we have a line of equipment that we think that we have that space available to be able to put that physical electrical equipment at that location. And is that a realistic possibility? And can we then utilize the overhead structure to come down utilizing either pantographs or utilizing drop-down plugins? And what would be best? Do we have the room, the clear height to be able to accomplish that? Furthermore, it's also, oh, sorry, go back to the other one. Furthermore, what becomes critical, especially on sites that are very tight like this one, is during construction, when the contractor comes in, when he is having to electrify, install the electrification for either pantographs or drop-down electrical or whatever, where do those existing diesel buses that have to stay on a route, where do they go? Can they stay on site? Do we have to move them off to another site? And so you can kind of see at the top of the page we're looking at the possibility of maybe expanding some of the paving area, so that those buses can be parked at that location while construction is ongoing. And so we're going to be looking at possibilities for that kind of approach at all the sites. So we can go to the next one. Okay, and so then this one is just a different possibility, and we were looking at this one specifically to see if we are since we are parking inside, can we utilize a platform and that's the purple area in the middle of the bus parking. Can we utilize a platform within that space to be able to locate the chargers and then distribute electricity to each of the buses from that location, either through pantographs or through drop-down electrical or what have you? The reason why we're looking at that one as a possibility is because our site area is limited. We don't have much green space in which to locate electrical. And so we want to kind of check and see if this is a real possibility. One of the limiting factors here is the floor to ceiling clearance, the clear height that we have. And if we actually have that, we got to confirm to realize this. We just need to verify. So these are some of the items that we're going to be out there looking at and trying to verify. This one is, sorry, there's one extra. Oh, I'm sorry. On Platt specifically, what we want to look at is down at the bottom right-hand side of the screen. This would be southeast. We want to verify that that is a good location. We believe that that's a good location to come in for all of our electrical. And then, yeah, exactly. And then we want to, and then how would we distribute? So we have two purple areas next to the indoor parking on the west and east side. And we think that, yes, exactly. We want to kind of verify that those are good usable spaces to see if that's a possibility to house the electrical equipment, and then distribute from there. And then if we go to the north side of the bus parking, where the green are articulated buses are parked, we would, yeah, exactly. We would also have electrical equipment on the west and east side of there as well. And so we just have to plan for that route. We want to go out. We want to go out there and we want to see if that's a real possibility before we sort of indicate it as a prime option. So that's just a general overview of what we've done and what we plan on doing next week.
That's in the details for us.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks, Carrie. Part of your tour group, Jyotsna has been involved in Fred in our conversations. I don't know if she's doing part of the tour. Is she part of the tour group, Katie or Carrie?
I'm not aware of who from RTD is going to be. I saw an email come through and I don't have all of their names in front of me right now. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Katie, I don't know if you have that in front of you, but we do have a list of days, times, people.
Yes, I chatted, but I only chatted to Julie. There's kind of an inventory of all the people that are going to potentially be there on site, and it's kind of getting its last minute finalization. So a work in progress.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, Holly, I would just suggest Jyotsna has been really instrumental on our side of the house on helping with electrification plans. And she's really well versed and can really contribute to the discussion. If she's not on there, we definitely want to try to get her as part of the group. Okay.
All right. We'll follow up on that, Fred. Thank you. She definitely has been involved in the earlier conversation, so we'll make sure that she's aware of this and participate as much as possible. Thank you.
And if you don't mind, one of the things I want to make clear, we only showed some of the sites just for time purposes. We have more sites than this, including the contractor owned sites. We're going to be out there as well. We just didn't show those for time purposes. So.
Yeah, I think that was a lot of weeds for us. So that was great. I can see you're doing lots of good work. Okay, any other questions or thoughts, suggestions for us? If not, we can move into the public engagement and then we'll call it a wrap.
Thank you so much. So as you know, we have been continuing doing some intermittent meetings. The first meeting that we had several months ago where we sat down with you and we talked about the guiding principles and then we brainstormed strategies around those. So that has been the focus of the last couple of months and through probably the August timeframe. We have an online engagement tool. We've gotten some great feedback. It's set up really fun. It's an idea wall. So you can look at people's comments and you can like them or you can, respond, things along those lines. The next couple of months, we're going to be going back to some of we've got a local governments team meeting on the 22nd. We're going to be looking at some meetings with some TMOs and TMAs. And again, doing this strategy discussion, as well as revisiting several groups that we met with last year. We call them sort of community advocacy groups. So early last year, we met with these groups and they actually helped us devise the guiding principles. Groups like Colorado School for the Minds, Colorado Center for the Blind, AFL-CIO, the LCCs, so we represent the disability community. So that's going to be our big focus over the next couple of months to sort of build on the fact that we met with them, they helped us develop the guiding principles, and now they're going to help us develop some strategies. So the last couple of months, we honestly haven't done a lot of super public facing over the last couple of months. And most of that is because RTD has so much going on right now. RTD has got a fair study. RTD's got strategic planning. We've got the accountability committee. There's a lot going on. So we wanted to wait until we had a little bit more substance to go out with. That said, we're hitting it hard in the fall. So in the fall, we've got all kinds of stuff going. We're going to have 15 telephone town halls. So we're going to do a telephone town each board member's district. We are going to have a very detailed survey around this surveys. And I should say in the fall, we're going to have some draft recommendations. You guys are going to help us get there. You've already helped us with provide a lot of that. So in the fall, we're going to have something for folks to react to. So here are the guiding principles. This is where we're heading. What do you think? So like I said, we're going to do some more online tools because we always have to do those, especially given right now. But we are, fingers crossed, going to do some public face-to-face meetings. We're excited about that. Lots of individual meetings, local municipalities go out to the chambers, things like that. And we're planning a youth listening session with Denver Public Schools. So the other thing I'll mention that I'm very excited about is RTD has recently hired a new transit equity supervisor. That individual is going to be working very close with us. His name's Carl Green, and he is working to really take a step back and look at a different way of engaging folks, especially folks that are a little harder to engage, people that are working a lot, that don't have time, that need childcare needs, that, just don't have a lot of time. So we are looking at it in our RTD is looking at models to incentivize some of these folks. Maybe you get paid to come and do a focus group with RTD, things like that. So it's a really exciting time for us in the fall. RTD is standing up a lot of new processes and really looking at new opportunities for engagement. And we're going to be working hand in glove with that group in the fall to really make sure that we're reaching out to as many people as possible and getting feedback to make sure that we're all pulling in the same direction. So like I said, it's been a little quiet in the front. We've been doing just some individual meetings, but we are going to be hitting things hard in the fall and the winter. And then come early next year, sort of that January, February timeframe, we're actually going to develop a video about where we are with this, and then do another round of public meetings to sort of close everything out, once we get to that point. So please let me know if you have any questions or anything, but wanted to let you know what our next steps are. We're pretty excited. Holly, do you want to hand it back to you?
All right. Well, that is all that we have for today. So if there's any other comments, questions, suggestions for us, I'd love to hear those. Brian and Bill, if you have anything for us, that'd be great too. Otherwise, we can wrap up.
Good to go. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Thanks all. We'll see you in a couple of months, and expect to see some follow-up on the meeting in the next probably week or two from us. All right.
Thank
you. We'll see you with some modeling results, hopefully, in a couple of months.
Yep.
All right, team. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thanks so much.